Okay, welcome to Chapter 7. Chapter 7 is all about arrays and this thing called an array list. So page 403. So let's begin. It talks about the introduction to arrays. So an array is one of the simplest data structures. Data structure is a term we use. In fact, we have an entire class on data structures. Just how you store data in a particular way. Anyway, a data structure can hold many values. So up to now, all of our variables have just been like age, and you can just store one thing in there, right? So an array can be names, and you could put multiple names in there. That's the whole idea. So let me go ahead and get started here. So I'm going to build me a brand new project. And we're going to call it Chapter 7. Okay. So this is pretty straightforward stuff. I mean, you go here, and if I just said something like int, and I use square brackets like this, square brackets with nothing else in between, and then say, I don't know, whatever, scores. What that is going to do is that's going to create me an array of integers. So that thing can hold more than one integer. Now, to tell you the honest to God truth, even though that is legitimate, let's go ahead and talk about the fact that all arrays in Java are classes. They're not the primitive data types. Even though integer is primitive, right? When you create an array of primitive types, the array itself is not a primitive type. It's a class. So to do this, I'm going to have to do something like, scores is equal to new int like this. Okay. Now, when you do this, this is where you tell it how many you want. This initializer, and it should be fairly obvious. I can combine these things together, right? I can do it like this. Int kumquats is equal to new int. Like this is the more common way of looking at it. Most people see it that way. Okay, so what does 10 mean? Well, it should be fairly obvious. That means that there's going to be 10 spaces where I can put kumquats or scores. Okay, 10 spots, so to speak. So this is a class, so it does require the new operator. Now this one is slightly different in that most of the time when we did the new operator, the thing on the other side of the new, on the right-hand side of the new, had bow legs. Remember that? Well, for some reason, they decided to cut you a little bit of slack. And when you're building an array, you don't have to put the bow legs in. It's just assumed. Again, it's one of those exceptions to the rules. Okay. So, behind the scenes, this is kind of sort of what it looks like. You have something, like in their case, they have a variable called numbers, plural. And then there's 6 elements in here, elements 0 through 5, where you can put numbers in. Okay, so let's talk about this thing called the index. The index is where you are in this thing, because this thing can hold, in my case, well, let's stick with theirs. In their case, it can hold 6 things. It can be in the first position, second position, whatever, but the index always starts at 0. So if you have 6 of these guys, it's 0 through 5. Okay? All right, good. And it should be obvious that you can have arrays of practically any data type. I mean, I'm just using integer here because it's easy, but I could have, strings or kumquats or, doubles or whatever the heck I want. Doesn't matter. The data type is not really all that relevant. Okay. So let's talk about the rules. Ooh, did your ears perk up a little bit? Did you grab your pencil and paper? Okay, rules. For creating an array. Well, the first one is, just like almost all local variables, they ought to be in just plain old camel case. Like in this case, scores and kumquats. It should most likely be plural. Most likely, because you're storing more than one thing. It's not score, it's scores. All the elements in the array are the same data type. In other words, when I'm using an array, I can't like put doubles in half of it and integers in the other half. In other words, when you tell it this is an array of integers, well then that's all there is. There's no discussion. All the arrays the indexes are 0 based. And you cannot resize the array. So if you picked the wrong number, and then later on you found out, ooh, that didn't work for me, I need 2 more, there's an awful lot of hoops you got to jump through to be able to make that happen. Okay, are you guys ready for a computer science joke? I certainly hope so. Okay, so here we go. I'm going to build me another array here. So how do you read this out loud? You read it out loud that's the hip hip array. Okay, I didn't say it was a very good joke. All right, you guys ready to move on? Okay. So on page 405, we talk about accessing array elements. So let's assume that I've got something, and I want to talk to the third one in the list. Now remember now, there's 0 base, so I'm talking to the third one. That would be, what they often call these subscripts. I don't really like that term. But, so for example, if I wanted to talk to the third one of the scores, I could do something like system.out print ln, and then just say scores 2 to get to the third one. That makes sense? Because remember, there's 0 base. If I said, give me the third one in the list, then the third one would be 2. Okay, good. Kind of makes sense. Now, I told you that the the array itself is a class. It's not a primitive type. But the individual elements in the array, well, those are primitive types in this case. So you can do anything you want, right? You can go in here and say scores sub 2 is equal to 12. Just like any other, just like this was a plain old integer, right? Anything you want to do and say, I don't know, answer is equal to scores sub 2, times 4, whatever you want, right? Doesn't really matter. It can appear on both, on the left-hand side of the assignment operator, the right-hand side, doesn't matter, right? It's just an integer. So each individual element, you can just squint and then say, okay, that's just an integer. I don't have to deal with all this array stuff. That makes sense? Okay. So let's move on. So inputting and outputting array contents on page 406. This is one of those scenarios where if you wanted to display the entire contents of an array, it kind of sort of makes sense that a loop would be the right way to do that, wouldn't you think? I mean, just kind of right off the top of your head, you go, okay, an array stores multiple things, and so probably a loop of some sort would be the way to go. Okay, so a for loop is very often used, okay? So we're going to do that with ours. We don't actually have that much information in our guy, but I'm just going to say for int. I'm going to go ahead and use index as a variable just because it's easy. Index starts at 0. Index is less than 10. And index plus plus. All right, you've seen how this part works. This is just a normal for loop. And then I'm going to say system.out print ln. And so I want to be able to use an array syntax, but instead of having 2 as a literal for the subscript, I'm going to use a variable as a subscript. This is a very common thing to do. So I'm going to say scores index. And that way it's going to, the first time through, it's going to give me, score position 0, then score position 1, all the way through. Cool? Makes sense? Let's run this, make sure it works. Make sure I didn't have any typos. Okay, first of all, I didn't put hardly any data in this thing, so it's not going to be very exciting. But there, I got my 12. Yay! Cool. All right, so that kind of makes sense. Now, this worked fairly well because we already knew how big the array was. It was of size 10, so 0 through 9. That kind of makes sense. All right. Now, it's a very common mistake to accidentally ask for an array index that does not exist. So let's just mess with this guy, and I'm going to say less than or equal to. Okay. So I'm going from 0 through and including 10. Let's see what we get. We get an exception saying array index out of bounds exception. The 10 is outside the bounds. Okay, so this is a very common thing to do. A very common error. So you just have to pay attention here. So anytime you ask for an array element, behind the scenes, the system is going to check to see if the number you put in there makes any sense. It's called bounds checking. If you put in a -4 or a 400, it's going to come back and say, no, man, we don't play that game. It's got to have to be between 0 and 9. So, yes, the machine does this for us. Kind of cool. Okay, so this is what's called the one-off problem, where you're building an array and you weren't really paying attention, and so you're off by 1, typically at the end. Most people don't get confused with starting at 0, but it's fairly common to mess this guy up at the end. Okay, so on page 411 they talk about array initialization. So there is a way you can create an array and have it start with a set of numbers to begin with, to initialize the array. So let me just go ahead and do my hip here, guy. So this one is yet another exception. I know. So this one, remember I talked about all these things have to have, all classes have to have a new, and then I said, well, except for strings, right? And then I said, arrays have to have a new. Well, maybe not. And so I'm going to use curly braces here, and I'm going to put in what the values I want the values to be, 45, and like that. Okay, so this is what's called array. This is an initialization list. That's what this thing is called, an initialization list. So let's go over the rules. Your ears might have perked up there. So the rules for an initialization list is, first of all, you don't use a new keyword. Don't you think they should be consistent, right? I mean, they have so many exceptions to the rules. This is an exception. You don't use a new keyword. And you don't tell it how big the array is. Here we told it 10. And here we just said, hey, man, you figure it out yourself. So the machine's pretty smart. It can count, right? Machine can look at that and go, oh, yeah, there's 4 of those. Okay? So you don't tell it how big it is. And then the elements, whatever they are, integers, doubles, strings, whatever, are separated by commas and enclosed in curly brace. Okay? Kind of makes sense? So let's just make sure this thing works. And so we're going to go down to here, and we're going to do for int index equals 0. I'm going to go ahead and cheat, and because I know how big that thing is. Index is less than 4. Index plus plus. We'll come back to how you can ask the array how big he is. And I'm going to say hip hip. Oh, wait, sorry. And then I'm going to say hip hip sub index. Cool. Hey, I'm going to need like a space or something here, otherwise you won't be able to see which one is which. Okay, I'm going to put that above this one and above this guy, just so you'll be able to see a space in the output and you won't be freaking out. Okay, so let's try this. Make sure I didn't make any typos. Okay, so here's the original one, and then here's the 10, and then here's those guys. Okay, kind of makes sense? Okay, as usual, we're coming up on the 15-minute mark, so you know what's going to happen next.